Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Nick, and today we're going to continue on to Chapter 2 of the Sympathizer, continuing on with our Let's Read. Pretty similar structure to the previous video. We'll get into a super broad stroke summary of the chapter, and then from there we'll get into a little bit more of a play-by-play, and then dive a little bit deeper into one of the scenes that I thought was just a little bit more important than anything else in the chapter. So without further ado, here is my broad stroke summary for Chapter 2 of the Sympathizer. So the Sympathizer, the General and his family, Bone and his family, and the selected members of the General's staff prepare to evacuate from Saigon. The Sympathizer recounts his meetings with Mon in the Catholic Basilica, including his newest mission, continue his spying efforts in America. The Sympathizer pays a bribe, and the group of evacuees make their way to the airfield where they wait for their plane. So I thought that this chapter was really solid. It helps to kind of flesh out Mon and the Sympathizer's relationship a little bit more. Their conversation is a little bit more buddy-buddy in this situation, at least in the Basilica segment. It kind of helps to also show a little bit more of the Sympathizer's feelings about his place in life, his feelings towards Vietnam, his feelings towards his role in the war effort, as well as his feelings about his identity and political identity, as well as ethnic identity. So I thought that this chapter was really dope, really good progression of events. Helps propel the story forward a lot. Obviously, it's a necessary segment of the book, which showcases the actual evacuation from Saigon to help us get to America, where I believe the lion's share of this book takes place. So yeah, let's get into a little bit more of a play-by-play of the events of the chapter. So the Sympathizer begins the chapter by talking about his disdain for the term bastard and the fact that the General only cared about the quality of his work, which is what the General says about the Sympathizer's heritage. He's not really concerned with the fact that he's kind of a half French, half Vietnamese bastard, for lack of a better term. It's another brick in the wall of affection and respect that the Sympathizer has for the General. I think that there's not a lot of people in the Sympathizer's life, at least people in positions of power, that he can really truly respect, and that truly respect him and his capabilities as a soldier, as a spy, as a man. So I think that this is just another example of the Sympathizer pointing out that he really did have respect for the General, even though they were, like I said in the previous video, playing for opposite sides. The Sympathizer speaks on his payment of bribes from a satchel of $10,000 requisitioned by the General. They begin to board the buses that will take them to the airfield for the evacuation, and before they leave on the buses, the General and his wife offer their sincere thanks to the staff that will be staying behind and offer them monetary compensation for the support up to this point. We're then kind of taken on a tour of Saigon. We go through a lot of different named streets. We go through kind of the maze that is Saigon at this point. He mentions that it's an uncomplicated route that is, to say, not uncomplicated at all. So I think you can kind of get a picture of the Warren-like streets that the buses have to traverse in order to make their way to the airfield and make their evacuation. The Sympathizer realizes pretty early on in the trip that the General is kind of taking free rein. He's not going the route that they planned, even though there's a curfew in place, even though there's a war going on outside of the gates. The General is kind of just doing what he wants to do. He's leading the buses in his Citroen car. He realizes that they're not going the right way. The General makes a stop at the National Assembly and makes a point of saluting a monument on the lawn of the National Assembly. Just another point of emphasis for the General's national pride I think it's somewhat of a performative gesture for the kind of people on the bus to show that the general, even though they are evacuating, he still holds a lot of respect and admiration for the Republic, and he's committed to making sure that they may be losing the battle, and unfortunately it looks like they're losing the war, but that the general is not going to stop fighting for the Republic of Vietnam. Even though they're kind of on their way out, the general tries to show that he still has faith in the Republic. There are foreigners across the street that the Sympathizer can hear laughing and joking, kind of having a good time. They're foreign journalists and foreign attaches that they're not really too concerned with the whole war element. They feel relatively safe, and the Sympathizer's pretty enraged by this. All these people are in really dire straits, and to hear people just sitting around and laughing and joking and having a good time, I think it kind of enrages the Sympathizer a little bit. He even talks about shooting in their general direction to get them to quiet down, in order for the general to kind of have his last moment of reflection in front of the National Assembly, which again showcases the Sympathizer's love and admiration for the general. He wants to make sure that this tearful goodbye is not interrupted and is not made anything less than it should be by people kind of having a good time near them. In this segment of the chapter, something that I wrote down, a quote that I wrote down that I really liked, that I feel like helps kind of encapsulate a lot of the kind of satirical nature of the book, and the kind of shake your head humor of the book. The Sympathizer says, "After the 10th putsch, I accepted the absurd state of our state with a mix of despair and anger, along with a dash of humor, a cocktail under whose influence I renewed with my revolutionary vows." So I think this is really indicative of the way that the Sympathizer feels about the situation. It's sad and it makes him angry, but you can't help but laugh about how kind of messed up the situation has been, from French colonialism to World War II, and the Japanese occupation, to the country getting split in half, to then the American intervention in the war. And after all of these events, it's hard to kind of look to the state as a symbol of strength and of unity, because even though there are all these people who are fighting to preserve the Republic, there are all these people fighting for the communists to kind of take over, and oust the Republican government. If you don't laugh, you're going to cry type situation for the Sympathizer, I think, at this point. And even though he knows that, he's not on the side of the people who are having to evacuate, even though he is one of the people who's having to evacuate, he's kind of having a bit of an existential crisis with it. He's not really sure that the country is capable of figuring it out. He's hopeful, but he's, cautiously optimistic, I would say. So after the scene in front of the National Assembly, we continue our journey through Saigon, and the Sympathizer is reminded of his life in the streets, the restaurant he gets ice cream from on dates, the nightclubs that he goes to, the streets where the former French colonists stabled their mistresses. We kind of just get a little bit more of a fleshed out picture of the area in which the Sympathizer lives and frequents, which I think is really cool. We're introduced to the Basilica that Mon and the Sympathizer secretly meet in. The Sympathizer remembers the conversation that they had regarding his new orders to evacuate the country with the general and continue his spying efforts in America. The Sympathizer is kind of taken aback. He's unhappy with the new mission, seemingly unhappy with the new mission, and wants to remain in Vietnam in order to kind of see the new regime that he's been secretly supporting take power, take control of the country, and see what life will be like under communist control. We learn of Mon's heritage a little bit, and his great uncle's service during World War I as a gravedigger for the French army, the radicalization that he experienced, that this experience fomented, and Mon and the Sympathizer work out a system of communicating through Mon's seamstress aunt who lives in Paris. The Sympathizer, still in the Basilica, has a fantasy of him refusing to board the plane at the airfield, deciding to stay behind because the war is almost over. He mentions as much to Mon, who reminds him that if he doesn't evacuate, then their blood brother Bon will refuse to leave as well. He kind of charges him with seeing that Bon gets out, because he knows that if Mon and the Sympathizer both stay, then Bon will have to stay as well. In order to save his and his family's life, the Sympathizer must evacuate with the others. The Sympathizer also admits that he does want to go to America and mentions that he doesn't really feel at home in Vietnam. They say their goodbyes in front of the Basilica, and Mon informs him that his return home is dependent on the general and his plans. Back on the buses, the group is waved through the security checkpoints by an officer that the Sympathizer previously bribes. The events of the bribe are recounted by the Sympathizer. Another quote from this segment that I thought was really good is the Sympathizer addressing the Commandant one more time. He says, "It is always better to admire the best among our foes rather than the worst among our friends. Wouldn't you agree, Commandant?" I really like that line. I think it's important to understanding the Sympathizer's psychology. Even though, there's a war going on, and even though they're fighting to the death, it's important to remember that we're all just people, and there's a certain level of honor that I think the Sympathizer subscribes to, and that he feels that people kind of deserve as soldiers and as humans. So the buses travel through the airfield, and they're let out at the compound of the Defense Attaché office, nicknamed Dodge City by the fresh-faced Marines there. The general hands over the keys to his beloved car. The group is forced to hand over their weapons, and they begin to hurry up and wait. The amount of American men and Vietnamese women that are attached to them is an uncomfortable sight for the Sympathizer. I think that he understands the kind of nature of these relationships. A lot of the women seem to be women of the night, and they have big families with them, and I think that that's kind of upsetting for the Sympathizer, but something that he kind of understands as a necessary evil for these people in order for them to continue living and continue to live safely. Bon admits that he kind of always knew that they would be evacuating, but he had hoped against it. He says, "Hope is thin and despair is thick like blood." So I think that Bon is in kind of an existential crisis type moment. He's a self-described patriot who thought that he would win, and I think that this kind of tactical retreat for him is something that he figured would happen, but something that he really didn't plan on doing or plan on doing happily, So then the Sympathizer falls into a bit of a reverie about the absurdity of life, that even though him, Bon, and Mon made the promise to each other to be blood brothers, that they would somehow end up on opposite sides of the war. The Sympathizer still remains true to his oath, though, thinking, if ever circumstances forced us into a situation where death was the price of our brotherhood, I had no doubt that Mon and I would pay. Bon postulates that despair may be thick, but friendship is thicker, and the Sympathizer, the chapter ends with the Sympathizer kind of mulling this idea over. So that's pretty much it. A little bit more of an in-depth play-by-play of the events of the chapter. The scene where they are kind of paying the staff that's supposed to stay back gets a little bit more into the general's kind of emotionality and how he deals with kind of leaving the staff that served him faithfully throughout the years. He gets a little bit emotional, and I think that kind of plays into his saluting the statue at the National Assembly. And yeah, the scene with the bribe is a little bit more fleshed out than I really got into in this play-by-play, but for the most part, that is the chapter. So as for the scene that I kind of want to delve a little bit deeper into, during this chapter, I thought that the meeting scene in the Basilica was super duper important for the kind of development of the Sympathizer's character, of his relationship with Mon, his relationship to his work, and to his commitment to the cause, more or less, to the revolutionary cause. It gives us great insight into the Sympathizer's feelings towards Vietnam. Like I said, his mission, his friend Mon, his religion, his parentage, so much more. When Mon initially tells him of the mission, the Sympathizer considers staying behind. He has this fantasy of staying behind and, telling the general and Claude that he's not going to go, and he has a fantasy of the general and Claude urging him to board the plane. I think it's funny. It kind of showcases a little bit of self-importance on the Sympathizer's part, but yeah, I mean, everyone wants to feel important, right? And I think that this is just the Sympathizer kind of feeling that way about himself and about his mission, kind of inserting himself into the grand narrative of the general and Claude's lives. So we learn that Mon's great uncle helps to instill the revolutionary ideology in Mon from his time as a gravedigger during World War I. Seeing the French dead, he scorned the idea of white demigodhood. It helped show him that the men were responsible for maintaining colonial control were the lowest of the low. That France saved her best men for fighting on her own soil. She had sent the schoolyard bully, the chess club misfit, the natural-born accountant, and the diffident wallflower to Vietnam. Mon's great-uncle's revolutionary ideology was only intensified by his falling in love with a French Trotskyist nurse who convinced him to join the French Communist Party, and we learn of the aunt who is to be the go-between for their continued clandestine communication. So it's important, I think, to understand where Mon kind of gets his revolutionary ideology from, as well as helping to show the fact that Mon kind of influences the Sympathizer. He talks about the study group that him, Mon, and a third unnamed classmate have during their schooling days, which kind of helped to propel the Sympathizer down the revolutionary path, while he says Bond takes a bit more of a traditional Republican outlook. There's a segment that I really liked that I'd kind of like to just read word for word. I think that it kind of showcases the way that, even though the Sympathizer wants to stay in Vietnam and see kind of what shakes out after the war, I think that this segment really kind of showcases his feelings about going back to America. Because remember, he's already spent some time in America. He's already spent a few years in America, actually going to college and kind of soaking up the American experience. So to be going back, I think that he's a little bit excited, and I think that this segment really showcases that. So this is after the Sympathizer says that, what if I don't want to go? And Mon kind of toys with him a little bit. He says, you want to go, admit you want to go back, and this is what the Sympathizer thinks about that. Dare I admit it? Dare I confess? America, land of supermarkets and superhighways, of supersonic jets and Superman, of super carriers and the Super Bowl. America, a country not content simply to give itself a name on its bloody birth, but one that insisted for the first time in history on a mysterious acronym, USA, a trifecta of letters outdone later only by the quartet of the USSR. Although every country thought of itself superior in its own way, was there ever a country that coined so many super terms from the federal bank of its narcissism, was not only super confident but also truly super powerful, that would not be satisfied until it locked every nation of the world into a full Nelson and made it cry Uncle Sam? All right, I admit it, I said. I confess. So I think that the Sympathizer is kind of enamored by America and by the kind of super powerful nature of American American culture. You know, he's kind of obsessed with the idea of America and about the abilities of the American experience and the American hard power, soft power, all of that. You know, he tries to downplay it, and he tries to make it seem like he wants to stick around and see what life will be like in Vietnam post fall of Saigon. But for the most part, he really is excited about going back to America and kind of seeing, not only continuing his mission, but seeing what life is going to be like over there again. He can't help but feel called back to the country, I think, especially because of his mixed heritage. The fact that his own people fail to see him as an equal. They see him as a bastard, as a half-breed, a French and a Vietnamese person. But in America, at least, he's not treated as a bastard. He's treated as a full-fledged Vietnamese person. If that's positive, if that's negative, at least over there, he kind of has his own personal identity a little bit more locked down, and he has a little bit more say in his own personal presentation than when he is in Vietnam. So Mon tries to make the Sympathizer's leaving a little less difficult by telling him that home is overrated. He tries to downplay the importance of sticking around in Vietnam, tries to make it seem like, leaving isn't really going to be that big of a deal. And the Sympathizer says, well, it's easy for him to say. His family gets along well, and he isn't the one who has to continue spying outside of their homeland. His parents are together, his brother and sister don't really care for his political ideologies. They kind of just continue on like nothing really is going on with them. And the Sympathizer kind of sees through his lesson a little bit here. He thinks that Mon kind of has a little bit less to worry about. So then the Sympathizer and Mon share their real goodbye on the front steps of the Basilica, and we return to the bus journey with the group finally heading in the right direction towards the airport. And I think that this really shows that the Sympathizer is a man of no nation. He feels that he doesn't belong in his homeland because of his mixed heritage. He feels that he's not really excited. He is excited, but he's not overjoyed to be returning to America because he does want to see what life is going to be like in Vietnam post-Vietnam War. In his mind, he helped the NVA and the communists more or less win the war, and now he's not even going to be able to reap the rewards of their efforts. He's not going to be able to set the woman free that he was unable to warn of the secret police coming in chapter 1. It is because of this feeling of transience that the Sympathizer accepts his new mission and begins to prepare himself for returning to America and continuing his efforts in whichever way the Communist Party decides that he will be best utilized. During the segment 2, it talks about the kind of layers of secrecy that the Communist Party helps to kind of insulate themselves with when it comes to the handlers and that sort of thing, and how Mon exists in a higher kind of echelon than the Sympathizer, and then there's one above him, and then there's another one above him. So the kind of bureaucracy that exists through the secret communist agents in Vietnam at this time. So yeah, the Sympathizer and Mon bid farewell. He leaves his books and his record collection to Mon because that's something that Mon has been envious of during this time. And yeah, I think that this scene is really tender and really important to kind of understanding the political ideology of the Sympathizer as well as his friend, and kind of showcasing the the kind of listlessness that the Sympathizer is feeling at this time. So I thought that this chapter was awesome. I think that it's important in terms of progressing the storyline forward. I think it does a lot of really good work when it comes to kind of fleshing out the Sympathizer and his kind of political ideology, as well as his motivations for continuing on this path and continuing to be the spy that the Communist Party is asking him to be. I think it's important that Mon is kind of the one who's asking this of him, and he's not really giving him an option. He's kind of putting the ball into the Sympathizer's court and saying, come on, you want to go. Like, you're excited to go. Admit it, confess that the prospect of being back in America is exciting to you. And the Sympathizer agrees. I think that the time that he spent there during his collegiate years and being back in Vietnam during the war and seeing that, he's kind of treated poorly by his fellow countrymen compared to when he was living in America. I mean, at least in America, he knows kind of where he stands in the social hierarchy, whereas in Vietnam, it's a little bit more up in the air. With certain groups of people, I think that he's an army captain, so he garners a certain level of respect, but when he's walking around the streets and three super low-level Marines are kind of talking smack directly to his face, there's not really a whole lot he can do to kind of refute that outside of pulling rank and saying, I'm your superior officer, you're out of line, So I think that he feels a certain level of alienation in his own homeland, which kind of helps propel him forward and helps to excite him about returning to America and continuing his spying efforts under new circumstances. So yeah, that's more or less the chapter in a nutshell. I like this chapter a lot more than chapter 1. Not that I didn't think chapter 1 was good. I just think that this chapter was better. It's a little bit more exciting in terms of the espionage thriller aspect of the book. It helps to kind of flesh out the city of Saigon and paints a really cool picture of the back alleys and the neon signs and the people kind of hanging in doorways and peering out of windows, as well as kind of the destitution that they experience, when he's making the bribe with the airport guard. He talks about how the money that he offers him is 3 months' salary for him and his family that are expected to survive off of just his paycheck. So I think it's really cool in terms of, like I said in the previous video, as a historical document to show kind of the way that life was at this time. And I'm excited for the next chapter, to go through the next chapter. I've already read the next chapter, but I'm excited to go through the next chapter. This next chapter, I think, is probably one of the more exciting ones that I've gotten through so far. It's a little hair-raising, as they say. But yeah, if you got any questions or suggestions, or just want to tell me what you thought of the chapter, let me know. And like I said, we'll get into it for sure. But other than that, if you enjoyed the video, also let me know. So yeah, that's gonna do it for this one, and see you on the next one when we get into chapter 3.